everybody. Welcome to another live stream of the History podcast. And today I have Edward Dodge with us. And today we're talking about God's wife. So it's good to have you back on the show, Ed.
Hey, Jacob. It's great to be here. It's been a while, so it's nice to be back.
It sure has. Yeah, it's good to have you back. So let's recap a little bit for those that may not have seen your prior shows. Who exactly is God's wife?
Well, we can start with the book I wrote. I wrote this book, A History of the Goddess, from the Ice Age to the Bible. That is, hey, there you go. Hey, that is where I'm discussing Asherah and the goddesses of the Old Testament that are there in the Israelites in the First Temple period of the Israelites that were there with Baal and the other Canaanite gods that get thrown out, on the way and the transition from Israelite paganism to Israelite monotheism. And my contention is that the Israelites were pagans before they became, the Jews that we know them as today, the monotheistic Jews, and that in that transition, the most important step was this divorce of the Divine Mother, which actually takes the form of three goddesses, a triple goddess, which for the Israelites were Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. But we don't need to get into all that, into the weeds on that. But basically, Asherah being the mother goddess of the Israelites. A famous book that came out a few years back, William Dever is one of the main archaeologists in Israel, one of the most important archaeologists out there. He had this book called Did God Have a Wife? He discovered some of the most important inscriptions that discuss Yahweh and his Asherah. Now, Asherah is a character in the Old Testament. She is mentioned roughly 40 times, always being denigrated, disdained, insulted, and ultimately they get rid of her. So she's never good. She's part of what the bad stuff that the Canaanites are doing, that the Israelite prophets are railing against and saying, telling everybody to stop, basically. And so when Bill Dever and other archaeologists, other scholars started digging into the story, I mean, they found a lot of new inscriptions in recent years, in recent decades. So a lot of this information is relatively new, biblically speaking, in that from the last 30 or 50 years, as far as the archaeological discoveries are. So for a long time, nobody really knew who Asherah was or what it was about, because there's also an Asherah pole. So those 40 references, a lot of the times it's an Asherah pole, which the Hebrew prophets, the Israelite prophets keep. They cut down the Asherah pole. It's an object of worship and of ritual for the Canaanites and the Israelites. And then the people would put it back up again. The reformers would cut the pole down, but these reforms were always very unpopular. In the part of the Bible we're talking about is the Book of Kings primarily. Also, the prophet Hosea, and some of the other prophets from that period, the early prophets. So she's very contentious and very important to the culture, but for the longest time, nobody really couldn't really make heads or tails who she really was, or or what she was all about, until the modern scholarship started coming along, and from archaeology, and started revealing more of the story. And so now what people are saying, what scholars like Bill Dever and other modern scholars say, is that she was the wife of God, the wife of Yahweh. I would actually go a little farther than that. I would say she was the wife and mother of Yahweh, because she's the mother of God. And so for the king of the gods, the highest queen he could get to is the Divine Mother herself, which is why you get these incestuous themes in mythology. It's not unique to the Israelites. It's in many mythologies. You get these sort of Oedipus type, Oedipus being a character in Greek mythology. These characters where the king marries his mother. It's all reflective of this notion of the mother of God, and the Divine Mother being the source of everything, of all creation. And that this was actually, my contention is that this is actually a very common worldview in the ancient pagan world, and it's a worldview that continues into modern day Hinduism. It never really entirely went away. We've got Kali behind me. She is the modern day Hindu equivalent to the Canaanite Anat, or Anat, Anat, Anat. who is the third of the triple goddess, along with Astarte, the love goddess, who King Solomon worshipped. So those three goddesses make up the triple goddess, and this triple goddess motif is a repeating motif in culture after culture after culture, that represents this divine mother and the mother of all. And this was very, very important and popular part of the popular culture, or of these times. She's the at the heart of all the festivals, because um, the mother brings us is rooted in the material world. So where you get the wine and Mother Earth, Mother Nature. So the idea is like the heavenly Father and the earthly mother. To put it in the simplest terms, the heavenly Father and the earthly mother were once upon a time the divine couple, and that in the Bible they're telling the story of the divorce, so that we only have the Father alone. And I can elaborate a little bit on that, but if you want to say anything, Jacob, that's sort of the intro.
Let me take the super chat real quick, and then after that, I would definitely like you to elaborate on that. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Is Asherah still presented and preserved in the menorah?
In the menorah and in the candle stand, I talk about the menorah in my book. By Jewish tradition, the menorah represents the tree of life, and the Earth Mother is all about nature. So the mother traditions are all nature-based traditions. So you get sacred sex, sacred plants, sacred alcohol, wine, beer. These all come from the mother, because you see in Greek mythology with Demeter, because these are all things that are coming from Mother Earth, from Mother Nature. And so there is an association, both by tradition and by inference, between the candlestand, the menorah candlestand, that is meant to represent the tree of life, or in the Garden of Eden, or variations thereof, that the tree of life is taken from these traditions of the mother. But as Jewish tradition moved on over time and over the histories, it was recalibrated, rearticulated, so that the direct references to the mother are taken away. In today's contemporary or even Orthodox Judaism, they don't talk about the mother. But I would argue that the very origins of the menorah, long since lost to history, do have its roots in these mother traditions. I would argue it.
Right, could you elaborate on what you were talking about earlier?
Yeah. So what I wanted to say, I brought a little visual aid here to go along with what I'm talking about. One thing I want to introduce, before I get into this, is to say that modern scholars are very skeptical of making connections from one culture to another. Modern scholars are all materialists. The academics tend to be atheists. They're certainly materialists, so they don't. There's no spirituality in academia. You can't make a spiritual argument in an academic journal. So they're only going to make material arguments about, this piece of evidence is directly tied to the next piece of evidence with a material connection, and you're not allowed to make an inference that is not, where you can't draw a direct material connection. That's not allowed in today's academia. I don't personally accept that from a spiritual perspective. I'm not an atheist, so I don't actually accept that from a spiritual perspective. So I will go ahead and make connections between cultures that the academics would reject. They would call it parallelomania, but I'm going to make the connection anyway. So here, what we have here is, if you can see this, I want to be careful with it. It's a little fragile. This is they're separate pieces. I don't want it to fall apart. This is, if people are familiar, is a lingam and yoni from India. I got this in India. These are very common in India. I will, you got the bronze serpent here. I'll set him aside and we'll come back to him. But what you have here is, it's a phallic symbol. So this is, yes, a penis and a vagina here. Although some people would say no, but it is. It's definitely phallic. This is used in the worship of Shiva in India. And I got this. This is a modern one, but these are very, very ancient. This is arguably the oldest continually used religious object in continuous tradition anywhere in the world. They're many, many thousands of years old. No one really knows when these things first started being used. but we see phallic symbols all over the place. So male, female. But what they really represent, so this is Shiva, and this is Shakti. This is the father, this is the mother. But more importantly, this is immaterial, and this is the material world. The mother is the material world, while the father is divine consciousness. He is, you can't touch him, you can't see him. Everybody, whatever your opinion of God is, everybody will agree that you can't touch God. You can't see God. You can't measure God in the material world, which is why atheists reject it, any claims of God. Whatever you think of God, we all agree on one basic definition, which is God is not here on the material plane. Can't see him, can't touch him, can't measure him. And such as consciousness in your what science tells us is in our brain, but mystics would say otherwise. Consciousness is also something that we cannot touch or measure or really, wrap our fingers around. You can't touch it. But the Mother Earth, you do touch. You can dig your fingers in and your toes into Mother Earth, into the soil, and very much touch her. And so this symbolism here is representing the mother and the father, and the immaterial and the material. And where you see this same model, and one thing is that modern day Hindus believe and will say of Shakti is that she is the divine, the source, the waters. She is the waters of creation. When you go back to creation in many, many mythologies, not just the Bible and Genesis 1, which I'll read to you in a second, but the Hindus have it. The ancient Egypt has it, where the creator god Ra has to, wrestle with the chaos of the source universe. Is just this chaotic, roiling ocean of chaos, really. And they often describe it as chaos. And it's the creator God that puts it all together. Well, imagine, the Big Bang. Imagine what was the universe before the Big Bang. It's a unformed, all the matter of the universe before it was put into the planets and the galaxies and, the universe as we know it. It was, a roiling sea of just matter, of unformed matter. Well, that is what Shakti is, the source waters, the source of it all. And when you go to Genesis 1, the opening lines of the Bible, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God covered the surface of the waters. That's Genesis 1 and Genesis 1 and 2, the first two verses. Now, God is very clear. God created the heaven and the earth, and there is a surface over the deep waters. God did not create those waters. Scholars have long recognized this. Biblical scholars, Christian scholars recognize this. God did not create those waters. He emerged from them. But those waters in the Bible do not have a name. This is very important. Goes unnamed and never really is referenced again in the Bible, but it's there in Genesis 1. It's very important. And that word surface is repeated twice, which is emphasizing the fact that there's separation between God, the Father, and those waters. Those waters are clearly distinct and separate entity from God. What's interesting is that all of the neighboring cultures at that time, when the Old Testament was being written, the Hebrew Bible takes form in the first millennium BC, sometime between 1000 BC when King David took Jerusalem, and 500 BC, which is, that time of the exile to Babylon. The first temple existed for 400 years there, 986 to whatever, 586. In that time is when I'm arguing is when they're experiencing this divorce. And so all of the neighboring cultures, whether it was the ancient Greeks or the Mesopotamians in particular, which is where the Israelites are getting their traditions, those waters have a name, and those waters are very clearly described as the source mother, the mother goddess. And so whether it's Namu for the Sumerians, and then later it's Tiamat for the Babylonians. In some eras, in the older eras, she's kind. later eras, she's mean, and they've got to get rid of her. But the point is that there is this source mother. A little aside note on Tiamat, the word for the deep in Hebrew is tehom, and scholars, again, Hebrew scholars have long recognized that that word tehom is a cognate of Tiamat, the Mesopotamian word for the divine mother. So there is a etymological connection there between those waters and the Mesopotamian mother goddess. But I argue that when the writers of the Bible are taking her name away, that is a very distinct and intentional theological. They're doing that. That is an important piece of theology. They're taking her name away because they're trying to remove her divinity. They're actively going through a divorce. And then we can get into Genesis 2 with the Garden of Eden story, which I also argue is aimed squarely at the traditions of Asherah and her priestesses, with Eve representing Asherah. So my argument is that we start with a mother and a father that go together, and that represents the entirety of the universe, the consciousness and matter. And mystics have been saying for thousands of years that consciousness and matter are coexistent. This is a long-standing tradition in the East, a long-standing philosophical tradition, and it is a modern philosophical tradition as well. This modern-day academic by the name of Philip Goff has written a best-selling book. You should actually get him on this channel, Jake. It would be very interesting. He's not a biblical scholar. He's a philosopher, but his argument is called panpsychism, and his argument is basically that what I just said, consciousness and matter are coexistent. Because, and this is revolutionary in terms of contemporary Enlightenment thought, because by Enlightenment thought, there's only a material world, and there is no non-material world. This is to the modern day scientist who has a materialist worldview, they take it as an a priori assumption, as a starting point of their entire worldview of a scientist, is that there is no non-materiality. There is no spiritual world. There's not only is there no God, there's no soul. You don't have a soul because they can't measure that. If you can't measure it, if you can't observe it through scientific means, then it's an illusion. It's superstition. It's magical thinking. And so the modern day scientific atheist just rules out the possibility of a spiritual plane of existence simply because you can't measure it. But the whole concept of the mystical traditions, which go back many thousands of years, is that consciousness is not just something that exists inside our brain. Consciousness is something that permeates throughout the universe. And the source consciousness is God. The High Father, El Elyon, in biblical terms, the source father, the High Father, who also has a son. We get into that later. Has many sons. But that source consciousness who actually put the universe in order, took those roiling seas of chaos and shaped them into galaxies and planets and Earth, and the suns and everything else, the stars and sun and all that. That there is an intelligence behind that, intelligent design, right? There is a source intelligence that put the universe in order. I happen to believe that is true. I don't believe that we live in a world of just happenstance accident, as guys like Richard Dawkins will tell us, that it is just a world of chance and evolution and physics. Like, where did physics come from? Where did mathematics come from? Humans didn't invent math. We discover it. So Philip Goff is making the modern day academic argument for why consciousness is the underlying substrate of the material world, and that consciousness and matter are coexistent and eternal, neither created nor destroyed, as far as we can tell, as far as our puny little brains will ever be able to figure out. That consciousness and matter are coexistent throughout the universe, and that consciousness is the underlying substrate of the material world. And that is where we get into the Father and the Mother. God the Father is consciousness, is divine consciousness, can't touch it, but it acts on the material world. Consciousness acts on the material world. The material world is not just a deterministic world of physics where one mechanism interacts with the next mechanism and is a rolling downhill from evolution and physics forces. There's very clearly all sorts of places in the universe and in day-to-day life where non-material things interact with the material world. And this is where the mother and the father come in, because the mother is the material world, Mother Earth. And then Shakti is the source mother, that is, not just the earth, but just the material source of all of the universe. And so she has her own logic as well, which is that it's a circularity, that before the universe was put in order, when it was just a roiling seas of chaos, it actually had a form, which was that of a hurricane or a tornado. It's circular, it's spinning. And in the center of that spinning is an empty space. In the middle of a tornado, in the middle of a hurricane, you've got, you've got the eye of the hurricane, which is empty. So in a theological argument, what the Hindus would say, that at the very center of that roiling sea of chaos is this empty space, which is Shiva. And then they describe Shiva as like a pillar, like an axis, like the axis of the planet Earth that the Earth spins around. Well, the universe has an axis that it spins around as well, which is they describe as like imagine a pillar of fire that extends up into eternity, as to forever, and down into eternity forever, and you cannot find the end. And the entire universe is spinning and hanging on this axis, but at the same time, it's not there. It's like it's an empty space, and that's what Shiva is. And at the center of that is what you get with this circularity is life, death, and rebirth, life, death, and rebirth, and this constant circularity to the universe. And this is a big difference between Eastern cultures and Western cultures and how we perceive the universe. In the East, they have a circular worldview. They think of They think of lives as being reincarnated, and after you die, you come back again and again and again. And many indigenous cultures have similar beliefs about circular time, circular history, circular creation. Whereas in the West, we have a linear. It is just it's an up and down. You go to heaven after you die, and you stay there, and you don't come back. And so linear thinking is very central to the Western worldview. We don't have a circular mindset. We have a linear mindset. We think of time as linear. We don't think of time as circular, but that's not the only way to think of it. And so that is key to this conception, because as you get into these traditions of the mother, they're all about life, death, and rebirth, and they're all about the material world. And so Mother Earth, all the things that come out of Mother Earth, all the plants, all the animals, and all the pleasures of the flesh, these are all the traditions of the mother that form the heart of much of the popular culture of the ancient world. The big festivals and the big, like the popular culture, like these goddesses in the Bronze Age, Ishtar in Babylon. Ishtar is the same as Astarte, just a different name. These were the most popular goddesses. Aphrodite in Greece. These are this is the heart of popular culture, because they bring us the stuff we enjoy on a day-to-day basis. And as we go through this Reformation, as the world shifted around, in the Bronze Age collapse, we went from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. There was a big meltdown of civilization all around the Mediterranean, and the Greeks and the Hittites, and all these cultures were wiped out. And you have a 300-year dark age, and that's the time period when the Exodus happened, I argue, and certainly when King David took Jerusalem, roughly from 1200 to 900 BC, is this complete meltdown of Bronze Age civilizations, which are then replaced with the Iron Age civilizations that are classical antiquity, the Hellenistic Greeks, the Old Testament Hebrews, etc. They're all in the Iron Age, and we've been living in the Iron Age for 3,000 years. And now we're transitioning into the Space Age, and we're going through another big transformation in our contemporary world. But my whole thesis of my argument is that the Old Testament is telling a story of a divorce. They're getting rid of these traditions of the mother, so only the father would rule. And this goes hand in hand with a cultural shift and a reduction in the status of women in society as we go from tribal matriarchal family structures to kingship and a hierarchical society based around kings and patriarchal families that were actually not the norm for most of human history. Most of human history were tribal matriarchies where women have much more authority, much more freedom, and specifically in matriarchal societies, they track the family line to the mother, not through the father. They track the family lines to the womb and not through the seed, and that means the women are not have. If you want to track your families to the father, you've got to control the women's sex lives, and that can only happen in a society where men are dominating women, and that was not the norm in tribal societies of the Ice Age or of the Neolithic or in indigenous societies in the modern day. There, the women have a lot of sexual freedom because they are tracking the bloodlines to the mother, and the seed, the man's seed, is anonymous. This was actually a big shift, and you see it in Greek mythology as well as in the Bible, where they're making a very big deal of instituting patriarchy. And along with patriarchy, we get a hierarchical class-based society with a king at the very top and slaves at the bottom. These things only began in the Bronze Age. There's no kingship before the Bronze Age. And then when we get into the Iron Age, it's all kingship. It's all kingship and patriarchy. But we've got a much longer history than the last 3,000 years or 5,000 years. We've got 50,000 years of where we can track traditions of the mother in the form of Venus figurines that were being made all the way back deep into the Ice Age, with no commensurate male figurines to go along with them. So there's a lot of strong argument, at least from inference, that people have been worshiping the Divine Mother for an exceptionally long time. And it was only relatively recently in human history that she was thrown out, and that, not thrown out everywhere, only thrown out in certain cultures, but in the Abrahamic cultures, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims are very distinct, that they are about the Father alone. In fact, you could argue that the definition of monotheism is that these are the only religions in all of world history that don't have a divine mother. They're the only ones. I'm not aware of any other culture anywhere in the world or anywhere in history that only has a father God and no mother to go along with it. And so my argument is that it's not an accident, it's not a coincidence. They were very intentional about getting rid of the mother. And part of the reason is not just to change the social status of women, but this is also where you get all the sexuality and the sacred sex and the temple prostitution that, they get rid of it. Obviously, they got rid of it. We don't have it today. But it was very common for a very long time to have, a brothel district, so to speak, around the temples. The Kadesha priestesses that are in the Old Testament, in the first temple period, the word is the holy ones. That's what the word Kadesha means. Now in English, it gets translated to temple prostitutes. And then the male equivalents, the male priests, were also called Kadesha, or the Kadesh, are called the temple sodomites, because they were transgender priests who were very common in these traditions of the mother all over the ancient Near East. You can find them all over the place. And basically every single culture has them, except for the Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And so, yeah, they had transgender people were the high priests of the mother goddess. It's a very important part of those traditions. It continues on into modern day Hinduism, never entirely went away. So all of the sacred sex and sacred wine, and some of the stuff gets degraded. And in popular culture, they'd have public orgies, and at a certain point, cultural traditions and cultural attitudes shifted. You certainly see it in the Roman Empire and the history of the Roman Empire, when they shut down on the Bacchus cults, which were, had public sex as part of their traditions. In the Roman era, they were quite scandalized by that, and and they shut it down. Sometime around 100 BC ish, in that era, is when they started in the Roman Empire pushing all that stuff, at least pushing it behind closed doors, where you couldn't have a public orgy as part of your religious tradition. But again, in the grand scheme of human history, that's relatively recent. For much of our history, sacred sex was a part of it because they saw the woman as the source of life, but it was also more specifically that the vagina was the liminal pathway by which the divine was made flesh. And so they would celebrate women's sexuality. They put it on a pedestal. Ishtar, that I was mentioning, was arguably the most popular goddess of the Bronze Age, the whore of Babylon in Revelations. Whore of Babylon was not an insult. Whore of Babylon was a title. She had a proudly worn title. She was the courtesan of the gods. And if you read the liturgies of Ishtar from the Mesopotamian cuneiform literature, I mean, they're practically pornography by our standards. I mean, you wouldn't, it's crazy how sexual they are, and very very explicit, and yeah, and like she's basically a porn star. Like imagine, I don't pick your porn star and put her on a pedestal, and with her legs spread open, and that being the most popular, center of the culture, and so when the Hebrew prophets are coming along, specifically Hosea. Hosea is really, the book of Hosea is all about this. His dispute with his wife Gomer, a woman of adultery who has children by other men, who's almost certainly a Kadesha priestess, although they don't explicitly say it, but either way, he's arguing with her. He's telling her to stop doing this stuff that you're doing, and he says very clearly, we're going to shut down your festivals, and I'm going to pen you in and keep you to myself. And she is forced to acquiesce. And so I argue that as human society goes through this cultural shift, they shut down these traditions. You see it very clearly in Roman history. You see it very explicit when the Christians take over in the later pagan era. They're very, very, very clear. There's texts about how the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, goes and shuts down the temples of Venus. Venus being yet another name for the same goddess. They're shutting down the temples of Venus with all of their degenerate behavior, and they've got a bunch of very explicit language for how they describe the people misbehaving. But what it's sexual is what they're doing, and the Christian fathers are rejecting that behavior and saying stop doing that behavior, and ultimately they shut it down with force. They shut it down with force, with violence, and make these traditions go away. And they kind of go underground, or they disappear to other parts of the world where they weren't shut down. But yeah, sacred sexuality is all wrapped up, is all an important part of the mother's traditions. And it's in this era when we have a world run by God alone, God the Father alone, that sacred sex goes away. They emphasize chastity, celibacy, and anything having to do with women having sexual freedom is explicitly taken away, because for them it's more important that that the seed and the line of the father is preserved. This is a very important theme in the Bible, as I'm sure the audience does not need to be reminded of. We could read long passages of so and so father begat so and so son, begat so and so son, begat so and so son, back to the beginning of creation. That stuff isn't there by accident or for no real reason. They are making an explicit claim that we have to track our families to the fathers, but not all cultures do that. Native American cultures into the modern day track their families to the mothers, and that has profound implications in day-to-day human behavior on a societal level. But yeah, so just to be clear, the mother is the material world, the father is immaterial, divine consciousness, and that the mother is all about this circularity, life, death, and rebirth. And the triple goddess represents that, the mother goddess, the mother, maiden, and death. And so you get a mother goddess, Asherah, Demeter, so many others the maiden, which is the young, beautiful, vivacious, but also independent, unmarried and independent woman who may or may not have children, depending on which culture, which stories you're talking about. And then a death goddess, somebody like Kali or Anat from the Canaanites, who's basically the same as Kali, except only with 2 arms. But Anat for the Canaanites is also got the skull and that, the necklace of freshly severed heads and the belt of human hands, and covered in blood, and in delighting in slaughter, because death is part of life, and death is the inversion of life, and you've got to go through death to be reborn. And so they celebrate death as well. They celebrate life and death. And modern day Hindus, they still do it. They will meditate on death all day long and then go have a great big party and get drunk and celebrate life. So not that all Hindus drink, I'm not suggesting that, but for those that do, they will dance, singing, dancing, feasting, ecstatic dance, all the kind of wild sort of behavior that is often denigrated in a Christian or Islamic perspective, Judeo-Christian perspective, where they don't want you to behave that way. The other societies that embrace it invariably will have a divine mother as part of their culture. I'll stop there for a moment.
A super chat from New Heaven and New Earth Unveiled. Thank you for your super chat. How would you interpret Isaiah 27:9 and Paul's use of it in Romans 11:27?
I don't know that verse off the top of my head. Do you have that verse? I mean, we can pull it up, I guess.
Yeah, let me get to it right now. Let's see here, Isaiah 27:9. Okay, so here's what it says. I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version. Therefore, by this, the guilt of Jacob will be expiated, and this will be the full fruit of the removal of his sin, when he makes all the stones of the altars like chalk stones crushed to pieces. No sacred poles or incense altars will remain standing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So he's discussing exactly what I'm talking about. So the sins of Jacob, the oldest parts of the Old Testament, the stories of the original patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they are actually from the deep in the Bronze Age, and at least that's when those stories are taking place. And they are actually matriarchal societies. Jacob has 2 wives, but if you read those, and then they one of the things that happens is his wives are Leah and Rachel, they're sisters. They steal the sacred stones from their father's house and bring it with Jacob, and there's sort of some cultural importance to that. But the point is that they were those sacred stones are part of these older pagan traditions. The idols, the idolatry that in Mosaic law they have to get rid of the idols. Well, Jacob predates Mosaic law, so they still have the idols. And likewise, the incense burners. We can come back to the my bronze serpent here for you. In Hezekiah, the king Hezekiah, who is one of the great reformers for the Hebrews in the Book of Kings, he's a historical figure. He lived in the late 700s. He witnessed the destruction of the nation of Israel by the Assyrians, and then was in turn attacked by the Assyrians. Hezekiah was the king of Judah, so he resides in Jerusalem in the 8th century BC. He's a genuine historical figure. There is lots of archaeological evidence of Hezekiah's, being a real person. And one of the things, and Hezekiah, he's one of the great reformers for Yahweh, one of the great kings from Yahweh, one of the few kings that biblical writers say from that time period was a good king, because he's true to Yahweh alone. And so Hezekiah leads a great set of reforms where they smash, they smash down all the idols, they cut down the Asherah pole, and they one of the things they do is they smash the bronze serpent that the people had been burning incense to. Well, I argue that bronze serpent is the same as this bronze serpent. This is where I was getting to the parallelomania that a modern day academic would reject my assertion that this bronze serpent from contemporary India is the same bronze serpent, not literally the exact same one. This is a modern one, but it's the same, has its roots in the same tradition as that bronze serpent that Hezekiah is smashing, and that they are burning incense to. So again, the incense is in other work I talk about cannabis, and that they are burning cannabis in the first temple. Hashish, which is a cannabis product, is an ingredient in incense, and so that would be one of the things that they are burning. Is this? These are traditions of the mother, and so when you want to smash the incense burner, is part of these reforms of getting rid of these pagan traditions, and so Paul is discussing the sins of Jacob, and because Jacob, in that he lived in a before the Mosaic law, he was still a pagan. He was still doing all this pagan stuff, him with his wives. So back to Jacob, his wives, just to demonstrate the evidence for them being matriarchal, is that in matriarchal period, the women name the babies, right? The women, the babies belong to the mothers. They don't belong to the fathers. So the women are the ones giving the babies the names. And so when you read the stories of Jacob and Leah and Rachel, the women are telling Jacob who to sleep with. They're having disputes between themselves. There's a rivalry between Leah and Rachel over, who's going to be with Jacob. And so the women, will make a deal between themselves. Say, oh, you can sleep with Jacob tonight. Or same with Abraham and Sarah. Sarah tells Abraham to go make a child with her handmaiden. And it's the women in charge of the sexuality, because in a matriarchal culture, the women are in charge of sex. And so it's not the men bossing the women around. It's the women telling the men what to do. And so as the culture shifts and we have these reformations, they push the traditions that they don't like away, including the bronze serpent. And we can talk about the snake. The snake is very important. And burning incense to it. It's and at least certain types of incense, the intoxicating incense, I would argue, is what they get rid of and keep just the non-intoxicating incense around. But yeah, sex and drugs is part of it.
All right, let's go for the next super chat. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Why would scholars ignore spiritual use in connecting over cultures? This makes no sense. This is what it's all about, more or less. But this is fantastic and shocking. How can atheist scholars make such a blunder?
I share your opinion. I was sort of shocked by it myself when I dove into the academic scholarship. But go ask a guy like Dan McClellan or any of these modern day atheist scholars. I guess, I don't know, Dan McClellan might not call himself an atheist, but Dr. Francesca Capullo, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was his mentor, who he learned from. She's an open atheist. All these other atheist scholars that are very popular today are very, like I said, they will only make a material connection. And so they call it parallelomania, and they reject it. They reject when you say this God equals that God equals that God. So if I say Astarte is the same as Ishtar, I mean, they will acquiesce to a certain connection when you can draw like a direct archaeological connection, and then they will acquiesce to it. Otherwise, they reject it. They reject that the pagans had. I argue that the pagans of the ancient world had one common framework. At least there's an Indo-European framework, and then there's a separate Egyptian framework that were later merged after Alexander the Great. But the Indo-Europeans had a common framework all the way through Mesopotamia that goes into Greece, that I argue it's the same pantheon of gods, and that they just keep changing the names, because you could go from one town to the next, or from one, society to the next, one kingdom to the next, and they have the same worldview, but they have a different set of priests. And so they change the names of the gods, but they're not changing the culture so much. It's just that they want to have a different priesthood. And so they just reshape, they take the same stories and just put different names on them. And you see this over and over again. You see the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who are northern and southern parts of Mesopotamia. They have the exact same creation story of the Enuma Elish. It's just for the Babylonians, it's about Marduk, and for the Assyrians, it's about Ashur. Same God, because the high God has many sons, each of whom is the lord of his region. And so they're all just the many different sons of El Elyon, the high, God Most High. And so whether it's Marduk or Baal or Ashur, um, these people had there was a continuum of belief between them. But these atheists, they don't believe in God at all, and so they don't believe that. They believe it's all just magical thinking and superstition. So they don't really want to admit that or make a connection that this group's set of superstitions is the same as this other group's set of superstitions, because it's all just superstition and nonsense of pre-scientific ignorant peoples, which is a worldview I utterly reject. And which is why I have a lot of problems with the academic take on this material. I think that today's academics are missing the story of Asherah completely. They are utterly missing the significance of the divorce, and they do fail to understand that Asherah is not just a wife of God; she's the mother of God, and that when the Christians use these titles for the Virgin Mary, Mother of God, Queen of Heaven, the Virgin, these were not new or unique titles in any way, shape, or form. These are really, really old titles. All these goddesses were called the Virgin. Ishtar, said she's the whore of Babylon. They also call her the Virgin. Her priestesses who serve in some capacity with these sex rituals. We don't know the details, so I don't want to overstep in saying exactly what they were doing because we don't know precisely, but we do know there was sex going on. They call them virgins, right? They call them virgins. So why is it that a woman can be sexually active and still be called a virgin? They clearly had a different sense of what virgin meant for them in that era. But these goddesses are always called virgins, even though they're very, very sexually active. And so, and then the serpent, the snakes are really, really common and a really, really important part of these traditions, because a snake, with the way it sheds its skin, seems to signify death and rebirth. And then also the way a snake can make a circle and eat its own tail also reflects circularity. So in culture after culture after culture, when you've got these raw, roiling waters of creation, there is a serpent swimming in those seas. In the Bible, they call it Leviathan. And the Hindus have a name for it. Every culture's got a name for it. It's there in the Egyptian traditions with Ra, where he's got to go battle this sea monster. It's a serpent. It's always a serpent. And because the snakes were both used in practical terms, they would cultivate snakes, because one thing that these temples did is they were granaries. They would bring all the grain in, and then they would use it as a place to store the grain and then redistribute it to the people. Again, a product of Mother Earth. The grains are the product of the mother. And then the grains in turn give you the beer. And the alcohol serves as the source of the party. And then we have a big festival. And so they would cultivate snakes to eat the mice, to eat the rodents, and protect the grain. And so there was a practical use of snakes in these ancient temples. You can see lots of evidence of snake where they were cultivating snakes. They'll have snake tubes to a lot of these temples. There's loads and loads of evidence of snakes being all over the place. And then it's very clear in the biblical tradition, with the divorce, they get rid of her. The Garden of Eden story is telling the story, is part of this divorce. It's like the divorce papers, signed, sealed, and delivered. The tree of knowledge, the tree of life, sacred trees and sacred gardens are what the mother are very much the mother's purview. And the snakes being in the garden, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is described as the wisest and the wiliest of all the creatures. But then God the Father is hostile to it, and crushes it under his heel. But that was a very radical, by the notions of that era, of the contemporary people in that era. That was a radical notion. To smash the serpent and to hate on the serpent was a really, really revolutionary and new and radical idea at that time and place. Because the Greeks didn't stop having snakes. The Greeks kept the snake traditions alive until, a much later era, for another 1,000 years, until the Christians take over. So the snakes are really important, and it's a very common symbol, and it's reflective of this divorce that in the West, that in the Judeo-Christian traditions, that they hate on the snake. It's part of hating on the traditions of the mother.
All right. Let's get to the next super chat. I efficient time for you super chat. Does Göbekli TP help this argument?
Excuse me. I would argue Göbekli Tepe is much older. So Göbekli Tepe is, if the folks aren't familiar, it's like the oldest temple site found anywhere in the world. And it dates to, I'm going to get my dates wrong, 6,000 BC, I want to say maybe 8,000 years ago. It's very early in the Neolithic. And so this is before the Bronze Age and much before the Iron Age, obviously. The Bronze Age begins around 4,000 BC, and that's literally with the invention of bronze. What you get with the invention of bronze is the invention of weapons. Prior to that, human beings only ever fought with spears. I mean, it's not to say human beings never fought before, never had conflicts, but there was not organized warfare prior to the Bronze Age. There's no evidence of organized warfare with city walls and kingship begins in the Bronze Age, and it follows the invention of weapons. And this is when men start asserting themselves. Bands of men, violent men, would go raid a town and force the people, kill the people, steal their stuff, force the women into slavery, sexual slavery. And that's the beginning of kingship, patriarchy, hierarchical society. That all happens in the Bronze Age. But prior to that was the Neolithic. All the way through the Neolithic, we've got thousands of years of Neolithic history, of which Göbekli Tepe is arguably, represents the beginnings of it. That whole long period between the beginnings of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, there's no evidence of warfare. And as far as we can tell, those were tribal matriarchal societies where the women were held in high esteem. And it was only later, thousands of years later, after, as I said, the invention of bronze weapons, that bands of men start asserting themselves. And then it takes a long time for kingship to take over all of society. It's a slow transition. But I do think what you do see in those early Neolithic towns, in places like Jericho, which is in the Bible, was an early Neolithic settlement that goes all the way back to some of the earliest settlements. You see some of the same symbolism. You see bulls, you see snakes, you see with bulls representing the bull of heaven or the golden calf. That's another one of these symbols that gets overturned. Why were the Israelites using a golden calf and then getting rid of it? Because again, it's part of these reforms from paganism to monotheism. In the pagan era, they liked the bulls. They liked the bull of heaven. That represents the male side of all of this. And so you'll see a lot of the same symbolism is incredibly ancient. You see the Venus figurines, these mother figurines. I trust the audience is at least somewhat familiar with the Venus figurines. These rotund, even obese female figures that are quite stylized, typically quite small. You can hold them in your hand. They're extremely common archaeological find. Thousands and thousands of them have been found going back 50,000 years, maybe 40,000 years deep into the Ice Age. And those figurines continued to be made. They never stopped being made. They were always being made. They've been found all over Eurasia, and you find them all through the Fertile Crescent during the Neolithic time period, including at Göbekli Tepe and in the neighboring settlements around there, like Çatalhöyük is a famous one, where you find a bunch of these Venus figurines. And one of the most famous ones is called the Seated Goddess. They're sometimes giving birth. The Seated Goddess from Çatalhöyük, she's sitting in a throne with like lions or leopards, under each hand. She's giving birth. She's very fat. And that same symbolism never went away. It continued all the way through the Roman era as the mother goddess Cybele. This is yet another mother goddess called Cybele that came from Anatolia, from what we call Turkey today, that was then in the Roman Empire imported into Rome. after they conquered that region, the Romans were quite secular actually in terms of governance, and that you were allowed to have whatever religion you wanted as long as it wasn't seditious or rebellious. Um, so you had lots of religions in the Roman Empire. Cybele was like, you might argue, the second most popular mother goddess after Isis, who comes from Egypt, which was the most popular religion in the Roman Empire, was the religion of Isis. She was the most popular goddess, or the most popular deity in the Roman Empire was Isis. And she is like Shakti of the Hindus in that she was officially seen as the source mother of all. And all goddesses were Isis. One thing about goddess theology is that all the goddesses can be combined together into Shakti, into the source goddess. And so they all sort of combine together, like Voltron, if you remember Voltron, that cartoon. They combine into Voltron, they combine into the super goddess. And so that's how she become the mother of, that's how she can be the mother of God, is that you take all the goddesses from every culture that ever existed and combine them all together into one super goddess. And that's actually what the Hindus say today. All goddesses are Shakti and or aspects of Shakti. And that's what in the Roman Empire, what they said about Isis. And Isis was formally syncretized with every other popular goddess of that era into being the super goddess and literally the mother of God and holding a higher position than God. They have a trinity as well in Egyptian religion. It's Isis, Osiris, and Horus, the mother, father, son. Well, the Christians have a trinity of Father, Son, Holy Ghost. This is not a coincidence, guys. When the Christians, early Christianity was coming along, they were arguing with the main pagans that they were arguing with wasn't Greek pagans. It was the Egyptian pagans. That was the most popular religion. And so when they're having theological arguments, about which religion should you follow, the debate was with the followers of Isis. And they have a trinity of Mother, Father, Son, and the Christians have a trinity of Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Well, Holy Ghost is just a placeholder where the mother ought to be. And so they get rid of the mother and replace her with the Holy Ghost. But, they keep the titles around the Virgin Mary, but they knock her off her pedestal. She's just the human mother of Jesus, not the mother of El Elyon, the high God. And so, I'm sort of the attitude of I believe in God, but I believe in the mother of God as well. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Oh, I would like you to expand on the connections and overlaps between Asherah and Mary. How many overlaps are we dealing with between the two of them exactly?
I would make a stronger connection between Asherah and Rhea of the Greeks, the Greek Titan Rhea, who's the mother of Zeus and the wife of Kronos. Kronos, for the Greek, for the contemporary writings of that time when Asherah was still around, they're equated. Asherah is the wife of El. El is the High Father. And the Greek writings explicitly equate El with Kronos. And so Asherah is explicitly equated with Rhea. If you want to talk about the Virgin Mary, the contemporary goddess would have been Isis, as I was saying. And so you see the titles of the Virgin, the Queen of Heaven, and Mother of God. Those are titles that Isis had. Those are titles that Astarte was called the Queen of Heaven. Ishtar was called the Queen of Heaven. Asherah, as far as I know, is so. Another thing about these three goddesses, Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, you will see in the literature and in the mythology that their identities are always very fluid. They're always bleeding into one another, and it's always very difficult for scholars to discern. You see this in the scholarship about Asherah and Astarte in the biblical scholarship. Anat's never actually mentioned. She's there by inference. She's a Canaanite goddess. She's never mentioned, but Asherah and Astarte are mentioned many, many times each. And the title Queen of Heaven is used in Jeremiah, I believe. Yeah, it's in Jeremiah where they use the title Queen of Heaven. I argue that goes with Astarte, but it's more important to recognize, as I was saying, that all these goddesses combine together, and they're all just manifestations of the source goddess. And so this title Queen of Heaven is used all over the place. And but in the Bible, I think it goes with Astarte. But I think my strongest connection, if you really want to be like literal about it, for Asherah, I think, is Rhea and perhaps Cybele as well. These are older goddesses. They're a little more raw, a little more wild. One thing about Isis, especially in the Roman era, was that she was actually quite demure and quite respectable and refined. There's not this wild orgy stuff with Isis. There is temple sex, but it's the prostitutes to Isis were considered the most refined and the most respectable. If you wanted to go to a respectable prostitute, you went to an Isis brothel, not to a brothel of Cybele, where I don't know if you've ever gotten into the traditions of Cybele in the Roman Empire, Jacob, but they are raw and wild, bloody, and there's a tradition where they would the parishioner or the worshiper would stand underneath a grate, and they would have a bull above your head on top of a metal grate, and they would sacrifice the bull, and the blood would all pour down on you, and you'd be covered in blood. And also the men castrate themselves to become transgender, and to become transgender priests. The Galli priests of Rome, there's all this literature about that. These are some very, very wild traditions, and to our sensibilities would be extremely shocking if we went back in time and were witnesses to these traditions, not to mention the child sacrifice stuff, which is not to the mother, by the way, it's always to the father. These traditions would be shocking. They'd be quite shocking to our standards. And it's very easy to see in retrospect that societal attitudes shifted. And in many ways, I think we would probably all agree that for a good thing. I personally would not be interested in a religion where I need to be, slathered in a pool of blood. Frankly, it does not sound very appealing to me. And I don't think it's very appealing to most people in the modern day. Maybe some people, but probably not most folks. But these older traditions were still quite wild. And so I do believe, I do sincerely believe that when I'm actually quite sympathetic to the Hebrew prophets in a lot of ways. I do think that they are trying to move society forward. They are legitimate reformers. They are trying to get rid of really nasty and gnarly traditions like the child sacrifice. It's like, hey, sacrificing your babies doesn't actually work. It's not actually going to bring about the rains or whatever else it is you're asking for. How about you stop doing that? But there's a dispute about it. If you read the Book of Kings, they're clearly arguing about child sacrifice. And it was clearly an older tradition. And the Hebrew prophets are reformers saying, stop doing that. And other people are saying, well, this is our tradition. Why should we stop? How dare you tell us to stop, in fact? And so there's a big argument about it. And it plays out over not just generations, but centuries. And so, and likewise, public orgies, I don't think is something that, a modern day religious reformer is going to get a lot of traction arguing for we need to have public orgies again to make the crops grow, because that's what they did. And they actually believed that sex makes the flowers grow, and they would have sex in the fields, and to bring about the rains and such. This at a certain point, people realize that this is a stupid and futile gesture, so to speak, and people should stop doing it. So I am sympathetic to the reforms. I just think maybe in certain respects they went too far. I certainly think they went too far in getting rid of the mother altogether. But yeah, sacrificing babies and covering yourself in blood, and doing like the Dionysian traditions of Greece are also part of this. So you had the Maenads that were the followers of Dionysus, women running around naked in the woods, grabbing wild animals and like eating them, like killing them with their bare hands and eating them raw, still living animals that they would capture by hand. These were, again, these would be shocking traditions if we went back in time. So I think I have sympathy. I have a certain amount of sympathy for these reforms. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for these reforms. I just think they went too far in certain aspects, or there's parts of it that we can bring back, minus the really ugly stuff. But those traditions, I mean, that was definitely a part of the culture, that the sex and drugs and orgies and bloodletting, this was human society did that stuff for a really long time. Yeah, so.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Edward Dodge.
Is that it? All right. Hey, great. That was good. Good stuff.
And I want to remind everybody real quick to go get A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to Bible. The link to purchase the book is in the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below and in the pinned comment. And also check out his YouTube channel as well, which is also down there too. Thanks again, Ed.
Thanks.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.